very exciting International Women's Day panel. First of all, I hope you've had a wonderful day celebrating women in all aspects of our lives and have spent a lot of time reflecting on what we have achieved and celebrated it, and also what we still have to do, the work that we still have to do. So it was a very busy day for us. There were lots of panels and discussions and celebrations. And we're going to tackle a really interesting topic this evening. Before we get into our panel, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Nuzhat Jaffrey. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, and I will be your host and moderator this evening. And I'd like to begin by starting with the Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Ameen. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Praise be to God, Lord of all the worlds, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. It is you we worship. It is you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not those who are the objects of your anger, nor those who have gone astray. Something I'm reaching the traditional territories of the peoples of Turtle Island. The sacred land on which I'm sitting today has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. I acknowledge the land that I'm on, is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto or Takaronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, the meeting place of Takaronto is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. As Canadian Muslim women, we recognize the connection between anti-Indigenous racism and Islamophobia, and we are committed to working toward justice for Indigenous women and girls across the country. So I am so glad that we've assembled today, and we have a very esteemed panel. Many of you have seen their work, you've heard them speak, you've seen their books. So I'm going to now introduce each of the panelists. And they're going to, each of them will be reflecting on our theme, and then we're going to get into some discussion. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Afua Cooper, who's a celebrated poet, spoken word icon, author, scholar, and historian. Her many books range across such genres as poetry, history, fiction, and children's literature. She served as the Poet Laureate of Halifax Regional Municipality for the 2018-2020 term. She's a founder of the Canadian Dub Poetry Movement and a recipient of numerous prizes and awards, including the Portia White Prize, Nova Scotia's most distinguished artistic award, the J.M. Abraham Atlantic Poetry Prize, the Bob Marley Award, and was a finalist for the Governor-General's Literary Prize for poems. Her poems have been included in numerous literary anthologies and on studio recordings. Afua holds a PhD in history and is the foremost expert on Black Canadian history, including slavery. She's put the issue of slavery in Canada in popular consciousness, and her work on that topic has been mobilized across several platforms. She's a full professor at Dalhousie University, where she holds a Killam Research Chair. Further, Dr. Cooper is a principal investigator for A Black People's History of Canada, a project that engages in new research on Black history, accompanied by a new Black history curricula. Recently, her work on Black Canadian history, for her work on Black Canadian history, Dr. Cooper was awarded the Royal Society of Canada's J.B. Tyrrell Historical Medal for outstanding contributions to Canadian history. Additionally, this trailblazing scholar was honored by Maclean's magazine as one of the 50 most influential Canadians, and by Simon Fraser University with an honorary doctorate, Doctor of Letters. Her latest book, poetry, The Halifax Explosion, is said to be released by Plum Leaf Press in 2023. So in alphabetical order by first name, our next is Sana Patel. Sana Patel is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto. She's completing her PhD at the University of Ottawa on the topic of intersections of online and offline Islam. Her research interests include online Islam, Islamophobia, religious authority, non-religion, and immigration. And the next speaker is Dr. Sunera Thobani. She is professor in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia. Her scholarship focuses on critical race, post-colonial, and transnational feminist theory and politics, intersectionality and social movements, colonialism, indigeneity, and racial violence, globalization, citizenship and immigration, Islam, gender, and Muslims in South Asian and Western media, South Asian diaspora, and South Asian women's gender and sexuality studies. Her publications include Contesting Islam, Constructing Race and Sexuality, The Inordinate Desire of the West, and Exalted Subjects, Studies in the Making of Race and Nation in Canada. She is co-editor of Asian Women, Interconnections, States of Race, Critical Race Feminist Theory for the 21st Century, Coloniality and Racial Injustice in the University, Counting for Nothing, that's the question mark, and the Deadly Intersections of COVID-19, Race, States, Inequalities, and Global Society. Her research is also published in numerous edited volumes and peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Thobani has served as a Ruth Wynne Woodward Endowed Chair in Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University and as the president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. She's a founding member of the Cross Canada Network, Researchers and Academics of Color for Equity or RACE. The recipient of the Sarah Shorten Award of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, the Dean's Award for Excellence at UBC, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So welcome, Sana and Sunera. You know, I feel very, very privileged and very blessed to have you all with us this evening. So if you could probably begin. Let's begin with Afua. Like I said, I'm doing this in alphabetical order by first name. If you could just sort of reflect on our theme and what your thoughts are on the theme of at the intersections, confronting misogyny, racism, and Islamophobia in 2023. Over to you, Afua.
Okay. Thank you, Nuzet. Happy International Women's Day to you and all the panelists and to everyone in the virtual audience. Is misogyny getting worse? Racism getting worse? Islamophobia getting worse? I think it all depends how we look at it. We're in this moment where we move from one outrage to the other. But at the same time, the spirit of resistance is there. People are fighting back. If you take it from, the highest level, which is, one could say, the government level to grassroots, there are lots of reasons to be dismayed. But I think this struggle is probably more effective at the civil society level, at the grassroots level. We depend on government to enact policies so on and so forth, public policies to challenge what's happening in terms of Islamophobia and misogyny and racism. Recently, Amira El-Gawabi was appointed by the federal government as a special representative on combating Islamophobia in Canada. And even before she took office officially, there was such a backlash against her. So that made me think, well, things are probably getting worse because some people, especially privileged white men, do not want to see a forward move on this issue of Islamophobia. She was asked to apologize. And even when she apologized, these voices were saying, well, she should still be removed. So I look at the issue of the women in Quebec, the whole issue of Bill C-21, and women who wear a headscarf in public places. So it could be school teachers, bus drivers, what have you. And it's kind of law now that they can't, or if they do, they would be fired from their job. And we have a prime minister who said, well, he won't wade into that. He will keep his opinions to himself. So I'm thinking, well, that's really whack, because you are the leader, you're sort of maximum leader of the country. And Muslim women, Muslim people are being killed for being Muslims. And here is a situation where Muslim women are deprived and potentially deprived of making an income. They could be single moms, they could be the main breadwinner in their family, but even if they're not, here they are deprived of an income. And the prime minister is saying, well, he won't give a statement, he won't wade into it. So maybe his way out was to appoint Amira, but at the same time did not support or protect Amira when the time came. So I'm not going to say things are getting worse or things are getting better. I'm saying we're living with these contradictions. We're living with this dialectic. What I see is, another thing I see is domestic violence against women, against Muslim women. We know we have a women's shelter movement for Muslim women called, what's it called? Nisa Homes. It's a women's shelter. And we see that, almost in every major city in Canada, which tells you something, that violence within the family, especially in this case, is increasing, or maybe it's not increasing. Maybe we're talking about it more now. Maybe it's become more public and women have nowhere to go. So we have these shelters, which is coming up from the community. It's kind of like a grassroots initiative. I want to call it domestic violence. I want to call it violence against women. I know the new terminology is intimate partner violence. But that, for me, that term, actually, I kind of think it does violence against women, because the overwhelming majority of people who are affected by this are women and their children, oftentimes their children involved. When you look at refugee women coming in, immigrant women, people who are victims of this kind of physical and domestic abuse, it's women. And I feel, again, before we started, we were talking about intersectionality. And I said, it's coming to be like a fetish for me. It's coming to be like a new orthodoxy, intersectionality, while I support it in so many ways. And so this term here, intimate partner violence, I kind of cringe whenever I hear it or whenever I say it, because to me, it's sort of, again, taking the spotlight of a certain population, which is hugely, hugely vulnerable. Muslim women coming in from outside, or Muslim women from within Canada. If you look over the past at least the past 2 years, so many Muslim women, Black Muslim women, especially from Africa, have been murdered by their husbands in America, in France, in Belgium. It doesn't seem to sort of make a splash in the Muslim world. And that could be, again, because of anti-Black racism. I don't know. But the spate of wife murders in France and Belgium and United States of Muslim women is kind of frightening. I know myself and my daughter have reached out to some of these influencer imams like Mufti Menk and Omar Suleiman and say, you guys have a big platform. Why don't you take this up? You know, Mufti Menk has like 500,000 followers, right? Omar Suleiman probably even more. But they seem to kind of shy away from this. And I'm wondering, is it because it's Black women who are being murdered? So that could be the anti-Black Islamophobia. I'm not sure. So I don't want language or discourse to obfuscate some real issues that are happening in the Muslim community and to Muslim women. And I also want to point to another form of violence that's affecting women in the Muslim community. And that is the state violence of not recognizing women's credentials. So many women who have come here are medical doctors. I met a woman on Sunday. We had an International Women's Day tea. She's trained occupational therapist from the Middle East. She comes to Canada and she's a hall monitor. Or was. She's gone into higher education because she's redoing her studies. It's criminal. And this is coming from the federal government where they're not recognizing people's potential. These women could really uplift Canada, could contribute so much. And oftentimes, many of these people, they end up in situations of violence, especially sometimes when a woman gets a little job and her husband, he doesn't, he's the one driving taxi or working at Walmart, and the whole self-esteem and jealousy thing comes in. But this is coming from the Canadian state. So I want to weave the state into this violence against women, against Muslim women in particular.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for those reflections. I actually have to learn more about the spate of murders of women, Black women in families, because I would like to understand what's going on. It's not talked about much here, so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit more. So Sana, I think you're the next person speaking. Please go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Sure. I'd just like to start off by thanking CCMW for having me on this panel. I'm really honored to be here. In terms of reflecting on the theme, I think for women, navigating many parts of society is already difficult, but due to our intersectional identities, things in our everyday lives become even more difficult. This includes not only gender, race, and religion, but also citizenship and language too, which can cause us to question our place in society and struggling with feelings of belonging and acceptance and sense of community. For example, for immigrant Muslim women, there are sometimes clashes of national and religious identities when they aim to integrate into their new home countries, wherever that may be. This results in socioeconomic insecurities in addition to other struggles. For Muslim women, we have to navigate a world where our existence is regulated. There's a fear of not only discrimination, but also anti-Muslim violence. Many studies have revealed that Muslim women are more likely to be victims of Islamophobia than Muslim men, and even more so for women who are visibly Muslim. Being racialized contributes to more likelihood of discrimination and violence, such as being a Black Muslim woman in Canada and the incidents of Islamophobic attacks that were reported in Edmonton and other parts of Canada. Many times Muslims are stereotyped, and when this happens, we're reduced to a religious being, and the focus is only on our religious identity rather than all of our intersectional identities. This is problematic as it takes away from our lived experiences as Muslims. And all of this prejudice, discrimination, violence against Muslim women, it occurs at many levels, individual, social, institutional. This needs to be challenged and worked on towards creating a safe and inclusive space like CCMW does for all women. In response to Amira El-Kawabi and the backlash against her and her position, I understand as a scholar of religion, scholar of religious studies, I understand that Quebec secularism as being neutral towards all religion, except Christianity, which is culture and not just religion. But when it comes to Muslim women, it goes back to being religion and not culture anymore. So again, Muslim women are reduced to their religious identities. Quebec has showed us through its policies that it does not respect the freedom of Muslims, especially Muslim women who choose to practice Islam in their own ways, be it wearing the hijab or the niqab or not. Instead of discussing Bill 21 and its impact on Muslims and the Muslim community, the backlash is on Amira as the special representative on combating Islamophobia. The problem here is Islamophobia, not anyone else or even Amira for being a representative. The conversation should be on how can Islamophobia in Quebec be overcome? How can Quebec create a space that is inclusive to all Muslims and other religious minorities? But as we see, the focus is already shifted away.
Thank you, Sana.
Nusrat, 1 minute. I'm being made a host, and so it shows up on my screen about admitting people. I don't think that should be the case, but I'm just letting you know.
Thank you. Yes, you don't have to admit people, sorry, because we were all co-hosts at the beginning. So Zainab, could you please fix that? And by the way, some people said that they couldn't hear me. Are you all able to hear me? Yes? Okay, wonderful. So Sunera, I noticed that you did that research on COVID too. So that would be an interesting piece of your discussion, because we haven't talked about that a lot. Please go ahead.
So I would also like to begin by wishing everybody a happy International Women's Day. Thank you very much to Nuzat and also to the CCMW for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be on it. Thank you also to my co-panelists and to all of the organizers who have worked on making this event possible. So of course, International Women's Day, we know, marks the organizing struggles and resistance of working women. And it is to those struggles that we're connecting when we organize events such as this panel. So there is a particular kind of class dynamic to International Women's Day that I want to highlight, because much of contemporary feminism, women's movements tend to overlook the issue of class. So I want to really acknowledge those struggles, and then to see that the panel today, when we're talking about Islamophobia, racism, misogyny, we have a long history of struggle that we are connecting to. So resisting Islamophobia is to resist and confront the racisms and the violent hatreds that are projected onto Islam, onto Muslims, onto Black and brown bodies, and particularly onto Black and brown women's bodies around the world. For Islamophobia, racism, misogyny have always been gendered phenomenon. They have always been violent phenomenon, and women of color's bodies have been central to their expression, their articulation, and their development. And what we see in the present moment is that Islamophobia, racism, and misogyny are remaking the international order. They are remaking international politics as well as national politics in Canada and around the world. So for me, it's really important to tie this Islamophobia, this particular moment of racist violence, to the global war on terror, which institutionalized Islamophobia in global politics. And we are living now with the various forms of violence, which include wars, occupations, invasion, securitization, militarization, and the migrations that we are seeing of refugees from these war zones on whom the nation states that have waged the war are turning their back, shutting their doors. So the forms of racism that were unleashed by the global war on terror also institutionalized Western supremacy in national and global politics, because of course it was fought in the name of defending Western civilization, Western values. And we are now living with the consequences of these wars fueling of white supremacists and other ultra-right movements around the world. So the global war, I think, inaugurated a new moment. It has had catastrophic consequences, particularly in the societies that were the target of the war itself across the Middle East, Central Asia. But also it has set off immense socio-political and cultural upheaval around the world. In Canada, across North America, but also in other countries as well. So we need to recognize that this moment is also shaped by this catastrophe, but its confluence with a number of other related catastrophes that was brewing before the war on terror, those sparked by neoliberalism, deregulation, and privatization, by ongoing forms of colonialism, imperialism, and for us in Canada, especially settler colonialism, by the imperialist rivalries that shape the global order. So this is also the moment in which the COVID-19 pandemic emerged, and it is linked to the long-term destruction of natural environments, a destruction that is also reflected in the climate crisis that is erupting with regular frequency and with greater ferocity around the world, including here in Canada. These catastrophes are deeply interlinked, and taken together, they are taking the planet and the peoples of this world to a point of no return. I don't think we can talk about Islamophobia, misogyny, racism without addressing this larger overall context, without addressing the extent of the socioeconomic inequalities that are increasing so dramatically in the countries of the North, and also the chasm between the North and the global South. This then are the conditions in which we are living with the forms of violence that women are struggling against around the world. And I think it's really important that if we are to come to terms with the challenges of the present political moment, that we do address how these catastrophes are all interlinked, because there is no way of fixing one piece of the immense challenges that we face without doing that in a way that, addresses all of the challenges, because they come together in very real, in very destructive, in very damaging ways in the lives of women.
Thank you. So that's really important. All of the things that are happening externally, how they interact with the racism, with the misogyny and Islamophobia, and the context for all of it being interconnected, interrelated. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that if we don't address all of these things, we will not get very far. So thank you very much for each of your reflections on our theme. I was interested in what Afua had to say about intersectionality and the fact that it's become an orthodoxy. And ever since the term was coined, by Kimberly Crenshaw, I don't know what she imagined, how it would become very sort of part of our regular vernacular. But I think, we have been at CCMW been thinking about moving from a liberal feminist organization to an intersectional feminist organization. So maybe, Sunera, since you've done research on the issue of intersectionality, you could help us understand what we mean by liberal feminist feminism and then intersectional feminism, and how you transition from one type of organizational or another, or is the transition really necessary? So please go ahead, Sunera. And I'm just going to ask our host, Zainab, if you could just put the four of us on the screen, because right now we're seeing everybody, please. Thank you. Okay, please go ahead, Sunera.
So liberal feminism, of course, is most associated with the feminism of white middle-class bourgeois women. And in fact, her story of feminism, the history of feminism, has very much centered around the treatment of liberal feminism as the very emergence of feminism. And then the feminisms of women of color, anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist feminists are then seen as, kind of an addition to this core of what feminism is, which remains stubbornly white even today. So liberal feminism is also, a form of feminism that has placed gender as the primary social relation that organizes the social order. And so liberal feminism, of course, has been contested from its very inception by anti-colonial, Black, third world, indigenous feminist movements. And liberal feminism, of course, by privileging gender as kind of at the core of the social order, has in turn universalized the experience of white middle-class bourgeois women as standing in for the experience of women, and the concerns and interests of these women as kind of mapping out the political horizon for feminist movements. So liberal feminism, emerged in a particular context, and it spoke to the interests of a particular class and race of women who, were very closely linked to the rise of the liberal order generally. So certainly, critiquing liberal feminism is an absolute necessity. And of course, women of color have been doing this for some time now. What's really interesting is how you come to this understanding of the organization. Mm-hmm. And it raises for me the question of how you are defining your organization as liberal feminist, and then how you are thinking about intersectional feminist as a way to kind of transition. Mm-hmm. The two are not mutually exclusive.
Right.
From, the way I have studied and understood and experienced these issues in my own activism. These terms in themselves do not guarantee a more radical or transformative politics in themselves. So my question would be, how do we even understand these terms? So it's really important to understand liberalism as a historical formation in very concrete, grounded ways, and intersectional feminism also in very concrete, grounded ways, because these are not abstract terms and they're not just abstract categories. So liberalism, for example, is the ideological political framework for the rights-based kind of approach within feminist activism. Anti-racist movements have also worked within this rights-based perspective and, very much focused on the issue of inclusion. So, we can think about traditions within anti-racist activism, which have also been liberal in their outlook, in their kind of, objectives. So, certainly we have to critique liberalism, but at the moment, liberalism remains a dominant ideology, the dominant political framework, especially with the decline of the West. And, the kind of changes that we're seeing around the world, which has increased the power of the West tremendously through the global war on terror. So even as we critique liberalism, would we not defend the rights that we have won through such long centuries, decades of struggle? Even though the rights-based paradigm is very central to the liberal order, we would still fight for the right of citizenship. We would still fight for the right of refugees to have access to citizenship, even as we critique this kind of rights-based framework. So I think that, there's no easy, simplistic way of engaging with these issues. What is really important, I think, from my perspective, is not to see the struggle for the rights as an end in itself, right? We have to have a much more radical, transformative politics than treating the kind of liberal feminist approach to rights as an end in itself. And which means we have to then critique the idea of inclusion in this social order. So what becomes really important for me is that intersectionality equips us to understand this larger social order. But it's not just the lives of women of color that are intersectional. Right. The power structures in our society, white men are also shaped by the very same kind of intersections, except that they are privileged and they're empowered by them. Mm-hmm. So I think we also need to be really careful about how intersectionality is being used. It gives us the tools to have a much more complex understanding of the social world that we live in. But intersectionality itself cannot lead to a radical political transformation. And I'll give you an example. Intersectionality has become a buzzword in most white feminist organizations, right? And intersectionality has been used to address the issue of sexuality, for example, in a much more, a substantive way by the feminist movement. And intersectionality, which began within Black feminist theory as a concept to put race at the center of our analysis, at the center of feminist activism, has dropped off the agenda for these white feminists. And so they have used intersectionality to extend whiteness, the politics of whiteness, by including sexuality, including queer issues, communities, building solidarity alliances with that, while completely sidelining the issue of race. And so, Melinda Smith, for example, calls this use of intersectionality the diversification of whiteness.
Right.
So, certainly, interrogating what an organization is has to remain an ongoing project. Perfect. But by just shifting to an intersectional, renaming, or that for me is not enough to bring about a really radical politics of transformation.
Thank you. That's very helpful, actually. So I am interested in hearing from our other two panelists on the same topic. Sana, please go ahead. How you understand the term intersectionality and how it has manifested itself in your work. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Sunera, for explaining, or I guess highlighting the significance of intersectionality in allowing and creating meaningful work and opening up opportunities for marginalized and racialized individuals like myself. I'll speak a little bit about how intersectionality informs my work. And as a first-generation Canadian who also is a woman, is South Asian, and is also visible Muslim, I have many intersectional identities that influence the work that I do. I saw my parents, who were very passionate about education, their own education, how they had to abandon their dreams to migrate twice to 2 different countries to build a future for their children. And they ended up having to, start life over again and again. So they unfortunately couldn't continue on their educational journey. So because of that, I appreciate that I have these opportunities to, I guess, do my PhD, work on topics or make meaningful work for people that look like me. So this immigrant struggle that I saw coming from a South Asian background, having grown up in the Middle East and choosing to wear the hijab, I am reminded every day of why it is important to try my best to contribute to the Muslim and the academic community, to advance research on Muslims in Canada, and to provide resources to people who otherwise cannot access them. So since I moved here as a kid, I saw how Muslims were treated, and especially post 9/11, I witnessed the increase in Islamophobic incidents, which made me realize that it is important to highlight the diversity of real Muslims, not what is just shown in movies, on TV, especially Hollywood, where Muslims are usually oppressed, Muslims are violent, and Muslim women who look like myself, they are always forced to veil. They have no say whatsoever in any part of their lives. And while this may be the case for some women, for many women, it's not. There's been a lot of research done on why Muslim women choose to wear the hijab, how they practice Islam in their own personalized ways, and how their life choices are influenced by the intersectionality in their lives. So my goal is, and always has been, to conduct meaningful and impactful research due to marginalization and the alienation of Muslims. That's not only I've read about, I've seen, I've experienced. I started off as a political science major, and now I'm working on religious authority. I'm working on Islam on the internet, Islamophobia, immigration, because of my experiences as a Muslim woman of color.
Thank you. Thank you. That's I am interested in actually in your thesis and also your findings from the research that you began to do. So we'll come back to that, hopefully. Thank you for that. Okay, Afua, your reflections on the topic of intersectionality. You touched on it a little bit, but looking at what Sunera had to say, I really liked her sort of positioning of it, and why it's necessary for us to, we can't just make this transition. We have to look at what the liberal intersectional framework was like, and how intersectionality now plays a role. So maybe you could tell us your thoughts, especially in your work.
Sure. Thank you, Nuzet. I'm very happy for the reflections that Sunera gave and that Sana gave. Really, really spot on, both reflections. In my own work, as a scholar and as a poet, I work on Black studies. That's what I do. The larger African diaspora, Black studies, more specifically, Black Canadian history. Because I was trained in history. That's what I do, and have been involved in setting up Black studies networks across Canada. So talking about this intersectionality in my own life, in my own work, I'm a Black Muslim immigrant woman. I'm from Jamaica. I have a Jamaican accent. It's not the preferred accent. It's not British. It's not Australian. It's not French. There's a saying, a poet friend of mine, he said the French accent is charming. The Jamaican accent is alarming. So, we have to deal with accent discrimination. So there are just a bunch of things. So, and also as a Muslim woman, as a Black woman, I also deal with Islamophobia from some aspects of the Black community, which is a Christian hegemonic community in many ways. We have a situation in Halifax, you may have read about it on the internet, where this Black woman principal really abused some Muslim kids in her school. It's a thing that's going on now. And I'm like, wow, this is incredible. This is incredible. As a principal, someone in a leadership position, I won't say much more about it because an ongoing issue, but if you can think about what I'm saying in that regard, first and foremost, the kids must be protected, right? Because here is this power hierarchy going on. They're children, it's middle school, they're 12 years old. So I also navigate that, the whole Islamophobia coming from segments of the Black community, but then there also anti-Blackness coming from segments of the Muslim community. So it's almost like a no-win situation. So for me, my faith is important. That's what gives me peace. That's what gives me, meditation, prayer. That's what gives me kind of this juice to go on and to be at peace, because internally we have to have peace and then go out there and do the work. So there are different levels. There are different levels of the struggle. I'm involved with an organization that does shelter work for Muslim women and for immigrant women who are victims or survivors, but certainly they're also victims of domestic abuse. So there are many levels that I come at it in my academic work, in my work as an activist in the community. And it's never an easy thing, but I think with your desire, with CCMW's desire to make this transition, I think what is critical that CCMW has, which I'm sure you do have, is a commitment, is a willingness to do the work, because it's so necessary. It's so vital. I mean, I echo all what Sunera said about, the liberal feminist framework. Intersectionality is great, but it might not be the antidote. How is it gonna radically transform the organization? Mm-hmm. So I would say that too, because when we opened up, before we opened, I had some of those thoughts that, how intersectionality is used nowadays. Noga Gale is on the program, and she has a great article that I use in my course on women's history, about, I'm just gonna say, the multiple jeopardies. So when people like Deborah King and Bell Hooks and Rosalind Turberg Penn, before Kimberly Crenshaw, they just never called it that, and Noga Gale, Diane Brand did their theorizing on this issue about placing race, kind of making race as important, at the center of our discourse. That's kind of shifted. I gave a talk last week on hard histories. That was the title of the panel. And I'm talking about Black history in Canada. And in the Q&A, someone asked me to speak about Indigenous history, because kind of with the saying, or with the subtext that Black people aren't the only one who suffered, So this inability to kind of sit with one thing and to sit with the trauma that Black people experience, many people don't want to touch it. So they'll bring in the disability. Oh, how can we talk about Blackness if we don't talk about disability or Indigenous rights? It's just kind of then what you do in going so left, and it may not be left, but you come right back to right and to the position where you started.
Thank you. That's a really good way of looking at it, that let's not go too far, so that in case we lose our way, actually, that's what I'm hearing, because we have to stay focused on our mission. So I wanted to ask, I know you started to talk about this, Afua, when we discussed what are the factors that appear to be exacerbating misogyny, racism, and homophobia. So we've touched on some of them, but honestly, when I look at what's going on around the world, I do feel like we're going backwards. The rights that have been won over time that we value, some of them are under threat, some of them are being eroded. Look at what's happening, south of the border on reproductive rights. And of course, the greatest impact of any action that's taken in that area will be on racialized people, and women, racialized women. So maybe we could explore that question. What are the factors that appear to be exacerbating misogyny, racism, and Islamophobia? Let's go back to Sunera, and then go ahead, Afua.
Just a bit on the reproductive rights south of the border. And also, I'm sure you know that in some states, they are clawing back Black studies. They're just exiting it out of the curriculum, right? But on the reproductive rights, when Roe versus Wade was, rolled back, of course, it was tragic. But, Nuzet, to be honest, I looked at it and I thought, well, let white women go out there and demonstrate. Don't call women of color to demonstrate. You know why? Because Donald Trump got something like 90% of the white women's vote. So if we're talking about what are some of the reasons, I think we go back to what Sanera was saying about, the decolonial frame. We have to look at that. Imperialism, white supremacy. Why did white women across all demographics vote for Donald Trump?
Exactly, yeah.
I'm knowing that this man was going to start the Supreme Court, which he did. Yeah. What did they expect? So this is where, they subscribe to white supremacy because there's a fear of immigrants and the fear of Muslims and the fear of Black people, and you go vote for Donald Trump. This is what he did. You go out there and demonstrate. And it was interesting. When I saw the news media interviewing people, interviewing women about, they were interviewing Black women, Chinese women, South Asian women. I'm like, no, go interview white women. Don't have us do your work for you.
Right. Well, that's a really good point, because you're right. They keep on voting for him. So one has to wonder. And they knew exactly what he was going to do, because that's what he said he was going to do. So he did it. So going back to the question, what are the factors that are exacerbating misogyny, racism, Islamophobia? Sanera, do you want to take that question? Oh.
Yes, I'll take the question. But before I do that, I want to go to this comment about going too far.
Okay.
I think the moment calls for us to go too far.
Okay.
To go so far beyond what we have even imagined, because that's what this moment is calling us to do.
Right. Right.
So I think that, this issue of rights is really important, because we know that since the emergence of this liberal kind of organization of rights and entitlements, these rights were accessible only to a very small population. Initially, white propertied men, and then the working class, and then white women. All, when I say working class, I mean white working class. And so, the emergence of these rights within the liberal paradigm were tied from their very emergence to the dispossession, disenfranchisement, and even destruction of peoples of color around the world. So liberal rights went hand in hand with slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, indentureship, colonialism, settler colonialism, genocide of indigenous peoples. So these two have always been integrally connected. And so I think when we think about rights in this present moment, we have to know that this historical pattern continues being reproduced. And it's being reproduced in a particular kind of way in this moment, in my understanding, through the changes brought about by the global war on terror. So I think that's a really important point, which then, it's how we understand the social world in which we live, right? How we understand our place in this that needs to be addressed. And so, if we really understand or try and think through how we are located unequally in hierarchical relationships with each other, but how do we get beyond that? And it's the investment in the existing social order, whether it is in Canada, the investment in this liberal democratic framework, at the global level, it's this investment in the existing social order, which I think needs to be really interrogated, challenged. That's the only way that I think transformation can be brought about by women's movements. And it's this investment in kind of, the liberal framework, which now has become hegemonic globally, in the Western paradigms, Western practices, Western norms, social relations, and Western ways of producing knowledge. That is what I think needs to be challenged. And in challenging and moving beyond that, I think that's the only, hope that we have.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. And I like the fact that you pointed out that we have to go, keep on going further, because I mean, if we don't seem to be making, like, this is how I'm feeling right now. I'm just going to share with you that we are really going backwards. We thought we were getting somewhere, but the challenges just keep on growing, and the Trump phenomenon has a lot to do with the way of the world these days, including here in Canada. All you have to do is think about the truckers' convoy here, and their stance on many, many things. So Sana, do you want to talk about that? Because I'm actually very interested in the aspect of your research where you said you were trying to learn about how Muslims gain knowledge on the internet about Islam, and what you discovered in the process.
Yeah, I'd actually like to start off by just mentioning some of the factors that kind of intensify Islamophobia and misogyny and racism. And some of these factors are cultural hegemony, which I kind of mentioned earlier, where one culture, it may be a religion that is disguised as culture, is considered higher or exempt from rules and is recognized above others. In places like Quebec, like this is currently in place and it needs to be worked on. And the issue, or I guess the need for control, when we talk about women's bodies, right? The need to control women, the need to police women's bodies, it results in policies that take away women's agency, what they can do with their reproductive rights and what they cannot, what they can wear, what they cannot wear. In some parts of the world, women are forced not to wear the hijab, as we know. And in other parts of the world, women are forced to wear the hijab. So this obsession with women's dressing and controlling women's bodies is obvious, whether it be from state or individual control. This also leads to gendered Islamophobia, and it's what we're experiencing as racialized Muslim women. The intersectionality of being woman, being Muslim, being racialized, all contribute to the lived experiences of misogyny, racism, and Islamophobia. Having all these identities makes it more difficult to avoid prejudice, discrimination, and the inaccessibility to resources in our everyday lives. I also want to point out that we cannot ignore Orientalism, right? Where people who look like Muslims, people who are Muslims, they're othered and they're alienated from society. The perception of Muslims as others or as foreigners adds to the stereotypes of Islam and Muslims as being threatening, violent, and oppressed. The view that Muslims are inhumane, Muslims are barbaric, while non-Muslims, but especially the West, they respect human rights. I mean, we actually see that south of the border, right? Like what is really happening there. And the West is more civilized than Muslims. And all of this leads to the regulation of Muslim identities. In my doctoral work, what I did was I explored how Canadian Muslims, especially Muslims from the millennial generation, how they look for religious information online. What is authentic? What is not authentic? How do they make meaning of religious authority? And one of my findings was that, yeah, they go onto the internet, look for religious matters, fatwa videos. However, most of the leaders or most of the imams, they're all male. Right. So now some of my participants, they had questions regarding woman issues, right? Periods, fasting, all of that. However, most of the information that they would find online was I guess, explained through fatwas, through Islamic legal rulings by male imams. So I had one participant who said she had some menstrual problems where she would get her period for 3 weeks, and was she going to be able to fast? And every time she did research, and it was like, yep, if your period 7 days long, sure, just those 7 days you don't need to fast, and after that you can fast. And it's that kind of fatwa was revealed by men, but they're not going to know how it feels to be on a period for 3 weeks, right? So so there were many findings, and then we explored kind of like what is authentic, what are they going to do, what kind of Islamic research they're going to do, and it was pretty interesting. But talking about intersectionality, gender always came when we spoke about religious identities, religious research, and looking up Islamic fatwas online.
Thank you. And I was curious about your finding that most of these scholars or the people that they were consulting were male, and also that you discovered Islamophobia along the way on the internet. Okay, so I don't know if you want to tackle some more of that, Afua, or shall we move to another question, or maybe we can go to the audience Q&A now, because we promised that we would do that.
Yeah, no, I think I've said everything I want to say. I just maybe Sunera misunderstood what I said when I said people are just going that way. I don't mean they're not going in the right way. I just meant when you put an issue, say anti-Blackness on the table, then they put disability, they put indigenous, they put queer, they put everything other than what you're talking about. That's what I mean. So at the end of the discussion or movement or whatever it is, the issue that you place on the table doesn't get addressed at all.
Yeah. No, I'm absolutely with you on that, Afua. All of these forms of oppression and exploitation are not interchangeable, and they continue being treated as if they are interchangeable. And from my experience, they're put on the table in a way that displaces race completely from the agenda. So I'm completely with you. Sorry, I was actually responding to Nuzat's comment about not going too far in the organization.
Right. I know, and I probably misunderstood.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification, because for me, I'm not feeling that positive right now about where we are at, as a society, as a community, as a Muslim woman, racialized Muslim woman. So that's really where I was coming from, and why we need to keep on pushing, because if we don't, we'll keep on going backwards. So, and I think we can open it up now. I see some questions. You can use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask your questions. I see some questions already in the chat, so we can start doing that. There's a question here for Sana. Do we explore the role that artificial intelligence and search algorithms play in the access to Islamic knowledge online? I imagine that as a racialized Muslim woman, my internet search would yield results different than if I were a non-Muslim white man searching for information on Islam. This could largely be because these tools are created with the default audience in mind, which is white men. Interesting. Go ahead, Sana.
Sure. Thank you, Farhana, for the question. As I'm doing my postdoc now, this will be a part of my postdoc research. So what I'm trying to do for my postdoc is kind of explore how Canadian Muslims are making meaning and producing Islamic knowledge on their own through the internet. And we have some research on artificial intelligence and Islam. Because this is such a new thing, there hasn't much been done on it. But I do plan to kind of explore how artificial intelligence kind of plays a role in the knowledge production of Muslims, in the meaning making of not only authority, but also authenticity of Islamic sources. And you're absolutely right about the algorithms. Like, I mean, if you were on TikTok, you know, TikTok's gonna pick up what you were looking at. TikTok knows, you know, what you're interested in, and it's probably going to be the same for artificial intelligence and fatwas. Actually, Gary Bunt, he's already working on Islamic legal rulings and AI. So if you're interested, you can look him up. I'm pretty sure he just published something on it, and it's really interesting. Thank you for that question. I can't wait to dig into it.
Thank you, Farhana, and thank you, Sana. Okay, we have a question here from Samira. She says, can you talk about how gendered Islamophobia informs media representations of detainees in Northeast Syria who Canada is refusing to repatriate? So, Sunara, do you want to take that question? I can repeat it. Can you talk about how gendered Islamophobia informs media representations of detainees in Northeast Syria who Canada is refusing to repatriate?
Okay, so I think that it's really interesting to think about gendered Islamophobia in terms of how women are gendered, but so are men. And so the gendering of Islamophobia, particularly in the treatment of detainees, has really focused very much on Muslim men.
Right.
And they have been pathologized and demonized, you know, in very stark ways. The issue of detainees, of course, women have been pretty much absent in media coverage. The threat that has been constructed has been very much around male detainees, even though we know that there are many female detainees as well, and children also, who have been held in custody. So the gendered kind of representation of this has really focused on the Muslim male body and the construction of the Muslim male as the most potent and dangerous threat. And I think we really are not getting much information at all about women's experiences, women who are detainees and are being held. So certainly the focus has been very gendered in media representation. And as I say, it's been very much centered on the construction of the Muslim male. It's also really interesting to see how minorities are being constructed. In the case of Syria, where we saw Christian refugees being, accepted and seen as the real kind of victims in this war. And so the gendering has gone hand in hand with the way in which other religious minorities in Syria have been represented. But for me, it's been really stark, and most feminist movements, women's organizations have not addressed how Muslim men have been pathologized and demonized in media representations. We lose Nuzhat?
I'm not sure if we've lost Nuzhat. That was just a bit. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. This is Shaheen. I'm just wondering if her internet fell or.
Yes, I think we lost Nuzhat. I'm sure she'll be back soon. I can continue on with asking the next question.
Thank you, Iman.
So Waiza says, interesting point, Sanera, about how the concept of intersectionality has been used as a tool by white women to diversify whiteness. And as a part of that process, sexuality and queerness was centered while race was sidelined. However, I think we also have to question what we associate with whiteness versus not. Queerness and a focus on sexuality is not necessarily a white issue and impacts BIPOC people, some of whom are the most marginalized. Would love to hear the panelists' thoughts on what is whiteness versus not as it relates to intersectionality.
So let me just make a couple of points, right? The way in which queerness has been taken up by women's movements, by feminists, bringing together this issue of gender and sexuality, has been very much the expression of white queer politics. Began with the politics of white gay men. And the most critical, the most radical tradition within queer movements, queer theorizing, is that of queers of color, right? But that is not the politics, the analysis, the conceptual framework that has been picked up by white feminist movements. So I think that when we're thinking about queer movements, issues of sexuality, we should really see which are the most marginalized voices in this politics. And for me, queers of color have been at the absolute cutting edge of critiques of sexuality, of critiques of heteronormativity, but in a way that has really centered race and colonialism. And we don't see that in the queer politics that have become dominant, that have become hegemonic. So I just want to make that point, right? So when we think about whiteness, I think we have to think about how these particular politics of resistance are being articulated. And if race, colonialism are not central to them, whichever social movement we're talking about, then they are engaged in, what I call the kind of reproduction of whiteness, the restabilization of whiteness that is taking place through the global war on terror.
Great. Thank you. Believe it or not, I lost power right in the middle of Sunera's previous answer. So I apologize for that. Are there additional questions that have come or are we?
We have one more in the Q&A. Do you want me to read it?
Please go ahead.
So it says, I'm a law school student graduating in less than 2 months. I'm the only hijabi in law school, and I feel alone in discussing what I'm going through with others. My mentors are white men or Asian women, but it's not the same. Any recommendations or tips on when going out to the workforce as a Muslim woman or even finding mentorship?
Good question. Who wants to take
Well,
that?
there is a Canadian, I may get the name wrong, but it's a Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association. Yes. If anyone in the audience knows the proper name, they can type it in the chat or something. There it is, Canadian Association of Muslim Lawyers. So the person who asked a question could connect with them. I think they do mentorship. And they're progressive. So that's one example I could give. I went recently, maybe about 3 weeks ago, to the Black Law Student Conference. They move around Canada. This year they had it in Halifax and I was invited. So it's, you're in a room with 500 Black lawyers or law students. Many of whom are Muslims, many of whom wear the hijab. I was just so pleased at that crowd. These are young people and, they want to make a difference. So those are two associations she could check out.
Yes, thank you.
I'll answer that. Can I just jump in?
Go ahead.
So I'm really sorry that you are going through this, that you feel alone in your program, but the good thing seems to be like you're going to be graduating in 2 months, so it will be over. If I were in your position, what I have done in the past and what I would do is reach out to someone who is also a hijabi, someone who is also a lawyer. And the good thing about the internet or social media is you can look up these mentors, you can look up these lawyers, professors, whoever it is, you can connect with them. I found that going to conferences or international work meetings, I was able to meet other grad students and mentors who looked like me or, who understood my experience as a hijabi, doing her PhD on Islam or whatever it is. But the social media, it's a good resource. yours and also organizations that Afua mentioned. In any case, I will also type my email in the chat if you want to speak or anything, but I'm here for support.
That's great. Thank you, Sana. Sunera, do you want to say anything about this? No. I should tell you, yes, there is a Canadian Muslim Women in the Law, the association that is all made up of all Muslim women lawyers. And also we could definitely, CCMW could connect you to lawyers who wear the hijab that we work with. And if you're interested in learning about the legal work that we do, by all means, get in touch with us. Thank you for that. Any other questions, comments?
Well, I have a comment, Nusat,
Yeah.
about CCMW, and this is just from my own knowledge because I don't know. Do you also help women with legal problems? Do you help them find a lawyer, pay their legal bills, that kind of thing?
So we help find lawyers. We have a legal services coordination program that connects Muslim women with lawyers who have experience working with Muslim women. So, they have to have, cultural competence. They have to be aware of some of the nuances and the differences between Canadian and Muslim family laws. So we do that. We do those referrals. Unfortunately, we can't pay their legal fees, except that we do have an emergency bursary fund for our clients who are experiencing financial hardships. Oftentimes, these are women who are also experiencing violence at home, and they want to escape the violence. Usually it becomes the last resort because they've been experiencing abuse at home for a long time, and they've decided it's time to do something different. And they contact us, to put them in touch with lawyers. We also connect them with other counselors, therapists, who may need those kinds of services. So yes, it's a pretty important part of the work that we do by coordinating services for the women that contact us. We have some multilingual capability as well. So it's, it's something new for us. We weren't doing direct service, but there was such a need, especially because of the legal systems that people are always struggling with, because many of them are immigrants, and they carry with them laws under which they were married, and laws related to custody, and also even just a simple thing like getting a divorce, an Islamic divorce, because that's what they want to do. So we're there for women who are looking for that kind of help. And I think we may have, yes. So we have put some links to the services or the coordination that we do in the chat. Okay.
So therefore,
yes,
just putting it out there, people, when they're thinking of giving their zakat, they could give it to CCMW.
Absolutely. Oh, you know what? I said I would do this for, I don't know if you can see this, but these are our beautiful jars. These are Palestinian dates, medjool dates from Palestine, straight from Palestine. And we're selling them during Ramadan, but you can buy them right now. But because, in Ramadan, people want to break their fast with dates, you can order one of these jars, and part of the proceeds go to helping the women that you're just talking about. So we help these women with a bursary. It's $1,000, which is, it's not a lot, but it helps them feed their kids, pay part of their rent, pay part of their legal fees. It's very important. So that's where the money from the dates is going. And if you're interested, you go to our website, ccmw.com. You can purchase them right from our website. The jars are great. The work on the label, it's a beautiful Palestinian design. Kind of hard to see here, but on the website it's clear. It's done by a Palestinian artist. So I had to put a plug in for that, because the money goes straight to helping the women.
Of course, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And just, I don't know who it was who going to be graduating in 2 months. As a lawyer, I don't know where you are geographically, but please connect with the CCMW chapter wherever you are. We have chapters across. If you don't mind telling us where you are, then we can connect you with the local CCMW chapter as well. Did we lose our law student? Anyway, in case she connects with any of you, please just remind her that she'll be very well supported if she joins the CCMW chapter, or we can connect her with one. All right, well, thank you so much for participating. Our presenters were amazing. I learned so much from all of you. Lots of food for thought. And I'm really, grateful to you for making the time to join us. Happy International Women's Day again. And now I'm going to ask our our president of the Toronto chapter, Shaheen Sayed, who's also a board member of CCMW, to give thanks to everyone and say a closing prayer or dua. Thank you. Go ahead, Shaheen.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm really struck by the fact that we had a group of women that are so supportive of one another, and not just individually, but as a collective. And I'm very struck by the fact that all of us are walking around with our own identities and always in our hearts and our minds thinking not in an otherness way, but about everyone. So that webbing that connects us is really something so beautiful that strikes me. And also that we're walking around with individual definitions and how we may be banging into each other in a way that could be more meaningful if we were to work on that definition aspect. So thank you to all of you. I'm going to close because one of the things that Dr. Cooper said that was so key is that what binds us ultimately is faith. And this is what keeps us centered, grounded, and in a place of heart and light to move forward. So I will end with a prayer that was offered by Imam Naved Aziz from Calgary. And it goes like this. Let us pray. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, our sustainer and our guide. Guide us to pure convictions that inspire in us the courage to match those convictions. We pray for peace, not war, love, not hate, benevolence, not greed, unity, not division. And we pray for protection from actions that contradict our convictions. May we honor one another, glorify you together, and inspire the world to be better. Let us be the light we seek from you. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just before we leave, I want to also thank our team at CCMW, Zainab Jamal and Iman Ahmed Noor, and also Hannah, who put together the poster, who did the promotions for this event, and who are taking care of all the technology this evening. And again, a very big thank you to Afua, Sana, and Sunera. You made this so meaningful for all of us. We have recorded this event, so we will be sharing the recording on our website. Thanks again and have a good evening.